Well, hello there. This is the first episode of Fantomas Friends. Unfortunately, the recording went tits up. I have the video recorded, my own voice is on the video, but the voice of Gregor is not. And that's why this is going to be a little montage of what we did do in our call, and it's going to be me and my smoothing voice walking you through and showing everything that happened. So here we are at the start. Gregor is just joining our call. This whole thing happened in Teams. I didn't do the recording via Teams because it has its disadvantages. I did a local recording, was hearing a Bluetooth headset, and then the audio I received in the Bluetooth headset wasn't recording with the editing software, so it all kind of went tits up. Gregor is introducing himself, and we're actually just going to dive into the call straight away. But as mentioned, so this is just an audio voiceover. I'm going to walk through what we did. And basically, I'm going to cut some pieces out. Sometimes we just were on the wrong trail or etc. I think the general process of what we did will still be clear, but it won't be the original recording. My apologies for that, and with that out of the way, let's get started. So Gregor is now going to a Fantomas issue. The goal of this Fantomas and Friends thing is that we just solve an issue that our guest has. So on Tuesday, when we called to try and check things out on the technical side, we formatted an entire code base of Gregor. One issue popped up with a compiler directive. It was really strange because it needed the lab binding before it in order to be able to reproduce it. So we're talking about this over here. The main thing that sort of is immediately recognizable is if you have a compiler directive, Fantomas will create two ASTs and will then later merge them after they get both formats. So we were thinking the bug is somewhere located around that. The issue was created with our online tool, and we will open it in the online tool as well to check some things further out. So we are now looking at the editor tool. We talked a bit about where the hash directive is not matching up to the beginning of the line when formatted, so that's already suspicious. And the proposal of all of this is always to have a failing unit test. Gregor prepared this nicely. He will now go and look into, I think he has already a unit test somewhere over there. He did some preparations, we sort of make a joke about it, and we'll get started. So inside compiler directive tests, Gregor copied a unit test from the one above. We're going to edit the name and paste in the problem that we have here. So he's copy pasting the original source code. And he'll get that in. Notice that our convention is to add the GitHub issue number on the end of the unit test line. We will create a work in progress name. I usually go with foo. The idea is that you change the unit test name with the actual cause of the problem. We can do stuff like that afterwards when you find a solution, because right now it's not really clear what is making the bug fail. Gregor will be then running the unit test and will end up with a failing one. Okay, you can see foo obviously failed. We can see there's just a difference in string, which is because we're not getting the format result that we're expecting. And the first thing we can do here is actually go to the code formatter implementation file. Then we go around line 400, there's a format function. This is the function the unit test will eventually get in there. So Gregor is now navigating to this format function. You can see the format function on line 408 takes the checker, the parsing options, the configuration. It will create multiple ASTs. You can see ASTs will then be mapped with the format with function, which will do the actual Fantomas logic. And then on line 417, we see in the function the value merged is the attempt to get everything back together. So now we're just gonna take a look at what's inside of merged and see whether one of the two code paths is already wrong. So maybe there's just a difference in configuration, one of the two is working, the other one isn't, so that already narrows it down. We are now checking what is inside results. So we're actually seeing already we have a list with one item, which is kind of strange. And we're now trying to check what's the result of that single item after formatting. And we can see this is exactly what we saw in the online tool. This is our wrongly formatted code. What's interesting is that I was already expecting the AST, based on the compiler defines that were in there, were giving us two trees and we need to merge them. So it already runs wrong very early on in the process in detecting what compiler defines are. So when Fantomas starts, it has a raw input string of source code, and we need to detect the combinations of the defines ourselves without any initial help with the compiler. So you need to tell the compiler to give you AST in a certain configuration. In our case, we want it with no flags and then just with the watch flags. So we should be able to detect the define flags. And what we're now looking in here is how do we get these define options. We can see we have a token parser that optimizes define sets, which gets our source and which will give you whatever possible combinations you have. So we're gonna add a breakpoint and see what is in all define functions. Gregor will need to rerun Visual Studio for that. So we are debugging again. It was earlier in the process. And if we look into all defines, we can see there's already one item in it. The item is an empty list, so it's one configuration where no flags are being passed to the compiler. So that means that the token parser interpreted something wrong. So that's what we know already. We'll need to look into that part of it. So we notice that our defines aren't okay. So the question is, where are they coming from? The watch isn't in there, so we're realizing that in the spot. See Gregor pointing his finger there, so it's like, something's up. And we try and trim down to where those defines are eventually being captured. This get optimized define set is a extra mechanism if you have Boolean logic in your defines. For example, if you have a lot of combinations, we do some sort of solving mechanism to find all the different code paths. And there's a maximum to that. So the max steps, we only allow 10 variable combinations within compiler defines. But that's quite of a unique situation. So we need to detect where this is all coming from. So we still haven't really got our defines. You can see that there are operators, Boolean operators. So we saw this do some magic to detect what needs to be formatted. With what ASTs do we capture everything? And you can see on line 227, the get tokenized hashes. These just give us the tokenized version of the compiler define hashes. So we'll check what comes out of that. And we're actually expecting that the if hash if watch as a token, as an F# token form comes out of that. So out of that source code string, we need to detect the raw compiler defines. And if we go in there, we can see that we did not find any tokens. So get tokenized hashes is already interpreting something very wrongly. And now we're switching back to the online tool so that illustrates this what's this, how is this detected. And you can see that there's a hash if in there, but the hash if is already is red because of how the compiler is already being tuned. So you can see there's no line 11, and that's because of what the compiler flags are. We need to detect those things, but we need to detect them before we even talk to the compiler. Because if you have like a nested hash if, then the compiler will not detect all the defines. So now we're passing a watch define to the compiler. And if we use the tool again, we now have a line 11, but we don't have a line 13. So imagine if there's a nested hash if situation, we can't use the compiler to truly capture all of them. That's why we need to just do it from the raw string. So now we are drilling down into this get tokenized hashes to see what's up over there. This is a bit of a messier part of Fantomas, so to speak. It's just, you need to be careful. You can't just scan every line and detect if it has hash if. It's okay to just interpret it that, okay, this is the thing I need to get my compiler defines. You need to be careful, because what if you have a multi-line string and there's a hash if something over there, then that one doesn't really count. So we're doing a bit of magic to capture all these things from the raw string, but not if they're inside a multi-line string. And now we're going to look into it line per line to see what is going on, because something is going on wrong there. So this trimmed is an empty line because our unit test starts in an empty line. Now you can see this is the first line, which is our load file n again. And we'll go over all these lines, and at a certain point we'll stop going over the lines, and that's where we realize that something is going wrong. We also realized that it was very inefficient to start the formatting unit test every time, so we created a new unit test in the parser and the token parser tests. That was a good remark from Patrick, actually. So what if we can just do a unit test for the function that extracts the defines inside of the raw string, and that was much more efficient, as we didn't need to get to detect it each time. And we also noticed that something was actually going wrong with that dot replace slashes backslashes to forward slashes, because all of a sudden when we fiddled around with the code, we started to realize that something is really going on with that slashes. And we actually go over to the online tool again and just start fiddling. What do we need to change over here to not get the problem? So I was wondering first, maybe it's it is the quotes that are not lining up. So let's just remove that section over there and see if it still occurs. We still have our problem. And then what is wrong with that replace? So maybe we can just remove those as well. Then we're removing the forward slashes, still have the problem. You can see we're removing the backward slashes, and we don't have the problem. So that's where we realize that, okay, something with that slashes and detecting whether you're inside a string to not check for compiler defines, something in that logic is wrong. And it was already good and very useful of the online tool just to pinpoint where we are. We didn't need to debug this a lot faster. So this is interesting stuff there. As we continued our search, we noticed that something in the is even or uneven amount of strings. If there is an uneven amount of double quotes, we sort of detect that we're starting a multi-line string, and then the next line should be skipped. So we use regex for that. So the regex that's incoming is either a single quote, a single double quote, or a triple double quote. So we noticed this was all of a sudden giving us uneven is true, and that didn't make sense. If you look at the source code, it has the quote.md quote, and then it has like the replace call, which also has 4 quotes because we're just replacing one string with another. So something was definitely going wrong there. And it turned out to be a regex bug. We're sort of extracting the count here, and a bit later we got the realization that this will end up being not what we expected. And so all of a sudden we start debugging each line, start of counting whether it's single quotes, double quotes, backslashes. And then we realize that if our replace, which has a string with an escape backslash, this is the problem, this is the culprit. So something in the counting of quotes and backslashes and all of it is going wrong. We sort of realize that. It's a bit hard to read in Visual Studio what is going on here with all the regexes that are not with a @ symbol before the string that makes things readable. But I guess I didn't went for readability there. So yeah, that's going wrong. We realize it. Our head starts to melt because we're not really regex kids, and we'll sort of end up with a hack. I will now just sort of fast forward it to how we solved the problem, and I guess this illustrates what area Fantomas needs to improve to get this better in general. So here we notice we actually have one thing in the original source code that is causing the problem. So the idea was just to replace that exact bit altogether from the source, just so we sort of sanitize the line. And we're trying to see in the F# interactive what we need to write as like the ugly thing to replace it. And once we figured that one out, we sort of changed this until we got it right. We sort of need to remove the spaces there as well. And we need to escape first the first double quotes. So now that we found that, we sort of still fiddle around. Yes, the compiler needs to know this is a string for the replace. And now we need to use sanitized line instead of regular line. And that's sort of the fix we went with. At this point, we were well over an hour in. The idea of this whole Fantomas and Friends is that we just sort of time box it to 1 hour. Just so to explain the process of how can we look in the code base for the bug. In a perfect world, we obviously solve the bug, but this was all a bit unscripted. I had no idea we would have the bug in this area of the code. I was actually expecting something more in code printer, but it wasn't the case. And then we're running our unit tests. And we can see that we have the unit test passed. So that was really good there. And then of course we ran all the unit tests again just to see that everything still works. We jumped a bit to a line, and then we sort of checked in the Team Explorer in Git, what did we change, how do we feel about this, and the conclusion was that this is definitely well enough to get a first pull request up and running. We'll mark it as a draft pull request. We'll just look at our changes. We're going to revert a couple of things. This actually solves a problem. This is already one step better than what Fantomas originally had. From a performance point of view, it's maybe not the best, and it just may be a good incentive to revisit the whole way of detecting the compiler defines within a raw string. And we're sort of discussing that, pros and cons in there. We're giving the foo a better name. And then we'll just sort of wrap up the development of this first Fantomas and Friends. And one of the next things I asked Gregor to do is to format all the code that we changed. We can do this with a fake target. This uses Fantomas itself, but a stable version on NuGet. It is required because in our CI/CD pipeline we sort of break the builds when the code isn't formatted. We're trying to be an example citizen there. The idea is that everything is constantly formatted. Ever since Fantomas can format itself, we've been doing this. So we're going to run this. And we also talked about, is a fake target case sensitive? Turns out it is not. So now we're downloading the internet. Let me just skip a couple of seconds there. And we formatted all the code. It's a bit hard to spot, but you can see that the files we did change were the ones that were formatted. And that's exactly what we want before pushing to a branch, pushing to GitHub. And that's sort of the last thing we'll do. We're going to open the, we're going to do the commit. We're going to open the draft pull request and sort of wrap up there. And as you can see, we wrap things up. We give a proper name to the pull request. We marked it as a draft, some pointers there. We'll see the CI, is this running? It's a work in progress. This was very good for I guess the first time. We had an interesting session, a lot of answers or questions. And when you focus on solving a problem with a bit of guidance of myself, I guess, you can really see that the source code is this much more makes sense. If you just look at the source without knowing what you're doing, it's maybe a bit hard and overwhelming, but when you're focused on something, it is sort of understandable, so to speak. And at this point, we're sort of just, wrapping up the first session. It was a lot of fun. I'm thanking Gregor for his attention, for his presence. Also, big thanks to Patrick Stevens from the G Research team joined the call as well. He gave some helpful pointers left and right, so that was also very good. And I guess this was sort of it. My apologies that the entire conversation wasn't recorded good. It's still a bit of a fuck up. But the bright side is that you watched through this thing in half an hour, and the eventual Fantomas and Friends recording was 1 hour, so it is a bit trimmed down. I hope it still all makes sense. Definitely leave comments and remarks. If you have any, you can check out the pull request itself. And yes, thank you. I'll see you next time. Goodbye and cheers.